It was an ordinary night, cold and silent. The clock struck 8:45 p.m. when I decided I needed a moment to myself. I left the house with no clear direction, but a sudden hunger led me to a discreet restaurant, far away from familiar eyes. The place had soft lighting and a cozy atmosphere, almost a perfect refuge for those who wanted to disappear for a few hours. I asked for my usual table, in a strategic corner, away from everyone, but with a privileged view of the room. I had barely sat down when a familiar laugh pierced the air, cutting through my thoughts like a blade. My heart raced. It was a laugh I knew all too well, but it shouldn't have been there. I turned my head slowly and what I saw made me lose my footing. There she was. Face lit up, a smile that used to be mine alone, now offered to another man. The woman with whom I shared my life, dreams and pain, laughing and toasting with someone who clearly wasn't just a friend. For a moment, everything around me seemed to freeze. The sound of clattering cutlery, the laughter of other customers, everything disappeared. I felt the bitter taste of betrayal rise in my throat. It wasn't just the fact that she was with another man, but how completely she seemed to have given herself over to that moment. My world collapsed right there, but in the same second, a rush of morbid curiosity kept me in my chair. What was going on? How long had this been going on? Who was that man? Why was she, the person who had promised fidelity, standing there, as if the marriage we had built together meant nothing? I approached slowly, not knowing exactly what to do. With each step, my chest felt tighter. When I got close enough to be noticed, the silence between them was deafening. She looked at me, her eyes wide in a mixture of guilt and despair. He tried to disguise it by looking away, but his panicked expression gave everything away. She stammered, trying to find an excuse that didn't exist. I can explain, she whispered, but her voice sounded empty, as if she knew that no explanation would be enough. I couldn't speak straight away. My thoughts were scrambled, and my mind oscillated between anger, sadness and a strange desire to understand. The only sentence I managed to utter was, "What are you doing here?" It wasn't a question from someone who wanted answers, it was a question from someone who wanted to confront. The lover tried to justify himself, muttering something about a misunderstanding, but the sweat on his brow contradicted him. Memories of our years together began to flood my mind. Every moment of happiness, every promise, every plan for the future. Everything seemed empty now, as if she had ripped the meaning out of those memories and thrown them away. My body shook with indignation, but my words wouldn't come out. The silence between the three of us in the middle of that restaurant said more than any discussion could. But then something in her eyes changed. It wasn't just guilt. It was fear. Not the fear of having been caught, but a deeper fear, something that seemed to hide an even greater truth. "You don't understand," she began, her voice trembling. "It's not what it seems." But of course it was. The elegantly set table, the candles she never asked for with me, the complicit glances they exchanged. It was exactly what it looked like. The lover stood up, visibly uncomfortable, and stammered, "I think I'd better go." But before he could take a step, I gave him a look that made him freeze in place. "You're not going anywhere," I said, my voice firm and full of restrained anger. He hesitated, like a cornered animal. I could feel the tension in the air. She tried to intervene, "Please don't do this here." "Not now." But I had no intention of leaving it until later. What shocked me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the coldness with which they seemed to have planned it. The choice of that restaurant, far away from everything and everyone, where I should never have been. Their confidence that they were safe. Everything seemed carefully calculated, and the fact that I was there at that moment was almost ironic. I couldn't help but wonder, was this chance or some kind of cruel fate? Dinner interrupted, the mood destroyed, and yet I knew that this scene was only the surface. There was something else, something I still didn't fully understand. The way she held her napkin so tightly that her fingers turned white, or the way her lover avoided looking directly at me. These were signs that something much bigger was hidden behind that betrayal. The air in the restaurant seemed heavier by the second. Other customers began to notice the tension, whispering among themselves. My heart was beating so loudly that I could barely hear the noises around me. The only thing echoing in my mind was the question that kept repeating itself, why? But deep down, I knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg. There was something in that look in her eyes, something that couldn't be ignored. And as I stared into those eyes that had once promised me eternal love, I realized that I was about to discover truths that could destroy everything I knew, or set me free once and for all. What were they hiding? Why was she, who always seemed so devoted, there, with a man who clearly wasn't just another? And why now, all of a sudden, did she seem so desperate for me not to say anything? Welcome to the channel where stories of love, betrayal and consequences come to life. Here, we make it clear, we never support or tolerate any kind of betrayal. All the stories presented are fictitious, created to show how infidelity can devastate lives and destroy relationships. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is intense, shocking and unforgettable. Take a deep breath and embark on this story that will stir your emotions. Have a good listen. The clock struck 6 in the afternoon when Daniel parked his car in the driveway of the house he shared with Laura. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and neighbors who rarely saw each other, except for the occasional nod. Daniel's face bore the weight of a long day, but as he entered the house, a smile escaped him as he smelled the familiar aroma of the dinner she had prepared. Laura had that gift, she turned ordinary moments into something warm and special. They had been married for 8 years. To anyone who looked at them, they were the perfect example of a balanced couple. Daniel, a civil engineer, was methodical and determined, but had a sweetness reserved for those closest to him. Laura, a literature teacher, was the opposite, a creative and spontaneous soul, passionate about the nuances of life and the beauty of details that Daniel often failed to notice. The contrast seemed to work. The differences between them, in the beginning, were seen as the spice that kept the relationship alive. However, as in any marriage, time brought layers. Layers of routines, compromises and unintentional silences. Daniel spent long hours at work, often bringing home deadlines and projects. He justified this as part of the effort to build a stable future for both of them. Laura, on the other hand, felt more and more like a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. She loved Daniel's dedication, but missed the man who, in the early years, used to surprise her with notes left on the table or unexpected invitations to dinner. That evening, as Daniel settled on the sofa in the living room with his laptop on his lap, Laura watched him from the kitchen. He seemed so immersed in his tasks that she hesitated before asking, "Would you like some wine with dinner tonight?" Daniel looked up for a moment, smiled kindly and replied absent-mindedly, "Yes, but just one glass. I have an early meeting tomorrow." Laura nodded, hiding a slight twinge of disappointment. The wine was an attempt to recreate the unpretentious dinners they used to have when everything was still new. But she knew that moment had passed. At the table, dinner went on with the usual conversation. Daniel asked about her day, Laura told him about her students and the challenges of teaching classical literature to teenagers who preferred to be on their cell phones. He smiled, asked polite questions, but there was no depth to the conversation. They both seemed to avoid topics that required more intense emotions. It was easier that way. When they had finished eating, Daniel stood up, collecting the plates from the sink. It was his way of giving something back. Laura stood still for a few seconds, watching him. He was a handsome man with strong features, but what she admired most about him was the serenity he conveyed. But that serenity, which had once been a foundation, now seemed like a barrier. Later, Laura went to her room before him. She was tired, but not physically. It was a tiredness that came from within, a restlessness she couldn't yet name. She picked up a book from the shelf and tried to concentrate, but the words seemed far away. Her thoughts revolved around the routine she and Daniel had built up. It was a good life, but was it enough? Their marriage had a solid foundation, but the feeling of emptiness that was growing in Laura made her wonder where everything had started to change. On the other side, Daniel was in the makeshift office he had set up in the corner of the room, reviewing projects. He wasn't indifferent to Lara's feelings, he just didn't know how to deal with them. Over the last few months, he had noticed her more frequent silences and distant looks. He wanted to ask, to understand, but there was something in him that always stopped him. Perhaps it was the fear of hearing something he wasn't prepared to face. Daniel loved Lara, he was sure of that, but the connection that had once bound them together seemed increasingly fragile. As the clock ticked down that night, Lara finally closed the book and switched off the light. Daniel didn't go up to the bedroom until much later, when she was already asleep. He lay down next to her, trying not to make a sound, but he couldn't help looking at Lara's face for a few seconds. She was still the woman he wanted to spend his life with, but it felt like they were on opposite sides of an abyss. The next day was business as usual. Daniel left early for work, leaving Lara still at home, getting ready for another day at school. In his haste, he said goodbye with a quick kiss on the forehead, not realizing that Lara was watching him as he left. She sighed, fighting the feeling of dissatisfaction that insisted on growing. At work, Lara tried to lose herself in books and discussions with her students, but her thoughts wandered to places she didn't want to admit. There was a void in her life that she didn't know how to fill, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was missing. Daniel, for his part, spent the day surrounded by meetings and deadlines, but thoughts of Lara kept him going. He remembered what it was like in the beginning, how she used to laugh at his unfunny jokes and how her eyes would sparkle when he talked about a new author or poem. He wanted to bring that back, but he felt trapped in the idea that work was his priority. After all, everything he did was for her, wasn't it? At the end of that day, as Daniel drove home, something bothered him. He couldn't name exactly what it was, but he felt as if there was a growing disconnect between him and Lara, something that required more than superficial gestures to resolve. Back at the house, the scene was the same. A silent dinner, superficial conversations, but the glances they exchanged carried a weight they were both afraid to face. The nights followed the pattern of recent months, Lara going to bed early, Daniel lost between deadlines and responsibilities. Their marriage wasn't in ruins, but the cracks were beginning to show. They both felt it, but neither knew how to start talking about it. And in the shared silence, the days continued to pass, as if they were both waiting for something, perhaps a spark that would reconnect them, or perhaps a chasm that would separate them for good. What they both didn't imagine was that fate was about to place before them a situation that would change everything. The days passed with the same predictable cadence that had dominated Daniel and Lara's marriage. Conversations stayed on the surface, gestures were mechanical, and their gazes rarely met in any meaningful way. However, a subtle tension hung in the air, slowly growing, as if something invisible was about to happen. One morning, while Lara was having her coffee in the kitchen, Daniel's phone, forgotten on the worktop, vibrated. A notification lit up the screen and, instinctively, her eyes landed on the device. It wasn't often that Daniel received personal messages, he was reserved, especially when it came to matters outside of work. The message was short, but enough to put a knot in Lara's stomach. "See you tomorrow. Can't wait. R." Lara tried to ignore the wave of thoughts that invaded her mind. It could have been something trivial, perhaps a work colleague or even a friend, but the tone of the message unsettled her. For the rest of the day, this restlessness took over her thoughts. She felt irrational for questioning Daniel, someone who had always shown himself to be trustworthy, but the simple phrase kept echoing in her head. That evening, as they ate dinner together, Lara tried to stay calm. She watched Daniel, looking for signs of something different, but he seemed the same. Attentive, courteous, but slightly distracted, as always. Even so, something inside her was beginning to change. Mistrust, a feeling she had never associated with her husband, was now growing like a shadow. "Any news at work?" Lara asked, trying to sound casual. Daniel looked up from his plate and smiled briefly. The usual. Deadlines, meetings, demanding clients. You know how it is. The answer was enough to end the conversation, but not to reassure her. Lara forced herself to believe that it was just paranoia, but the message she had received that morning wouldn't leave her mind. Who was R? Why did it seem so personal? She knew she was crossing a line by going through his phone without permission, but the impulse was stronger than her judgment. The next few days were a mixture of anxiety and doubt. Lara watched Daniel's every move more closely. He seemed more absent, often checking his cell phone, something he had rarely done before. She knew she needed to confront him, but part of her hesitated. She was afraid of the answer, afraid that her suspicions would be confirmed. The opportunity arose on a Saturday evening. Daniel mentioned a work dinner with colleagues. It was common for him to attend these gatherings, but Lara sensed that something was wrong. The way he avoided her eyes and explaining the event and his haste to leave the house aroused even more suspicion. After Daniel left, Lara stayed at home, trying to concentrate on a book or anything else that would distract her, but the restlessness was unbearable. Then, on an impulse, she decided to follow him. She took the car and drove towards the restaurant where he said he would be, with her heart racing and a mixture of guilt and determination. When she arrived at the restaurant, she parked in an inconspicuous spot and went in, looking around. The atmosphere was elegant, with well-decorated tables and soft lighting. Lara scanned the room, looking for Daniel's familiar face, but couldn't find him. Then she noticed a male figure sitting at a table at the back, accompanied by a woman. Her heart almost stopped. It was him. Daniel was sitting with someone who was definitely not a work colleague. He was smiling, a smile Lara hadn't seen for a while. The woman, an elegant brunette, was leaning towards him, touching his hand intimately. They were laughing, sharing something that seemed deeply personal. Lara felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The initial shock gave way to a mixture of anger and sadness. She didn't know whether to confront them right there or leave before she was noticed. Every second seemed to drag by as she struggled to control the tears that began to flow. She had never imagined that she would be in that position, spying on the man she loved and discovering something she had never expected to find. Trying to stay calm, Lara hid behind a nearby pillar, watching from afar. She needed to understand what was going on before she took any action. Over the next few minutes, she saw Daniel and the woman exchanging gestures and glances that left little room for doubt. It was clear that there was something more between them, something that went beyond a simple friendship or professional relationship. Then something inside her broke. It was as if all the moments they had shared together, all the promises and plans, had been torn apart before her eyes. She wanted to scream, to demand explanations, but at the same time, she felt paralyzed. What would she do after that? How could she move on knowing that something so fundamental in her life was falling apart? Without realizing it, Lara took a false step, knocking over a small decorative vase that was nearby. The noise caught Daniel's attention and he immediately looked in her direction. Their eyes met and his face turned into a mask of surprise and panic. The woman next to him noticed the change and also looked at Lara, visibly uncomfortable. "Lara," Daniel began, standing up hastily. He seemed to want to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Lara, her voice trembling, simply said, "What's going on here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel seemed lost, unable to formulate an answer that made sense. The woman next to him looked away, as if she wanted to disappear. It was clear that they hadn't expected to be found out, and the moment of embarrassment was enough for Lara to understand what she needed. "I don't want to hear any excuses now, Daniel," she said, her voice firm despite the obvious pain. "Just go home." Lara turned and left the restaurant, fighting back tears. As she walked to her car, she knew that this was only the first part of a storm to come. She still didn't know what she would do, but she was sure that the consequences of that night would be profound and irreversible. That same evening, Lara was at home, sitting on the sofa in the living room, her eyes fixed on the emptiness, while a storm of thoughts raged in her mind. Daniel had returned from the restaurant minutes ago, walking through the door like a defeated man, unable to make eye contact with her. The silence between them was deafening. He knew he needed to talk, but Lara, on the other hand, was on the verge of an explosion of emotions. "I want to know the truth, Daniel. Now. No beating around the bush, no lies." Her voice was low, but carried a firmness he rarely heard. Daniel took a deep breath, running his hands through his hair as he sat down in an armchair on the other side of the room. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but he knew there were no easy ways to explain what was happening. He had been caught. There were no more excuses, no more hiding places. I don't know how to start, Lara." He finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't want you to find out like that." She laughed bitterly, leaning forward, her eyes fixed on him. "And how exactly did you want me to find out, Daniel? Because, from what I saw today, you didn't exactly seem concerned about hiding anything." Daniel closed his eyes, as if to block out the words he heard. But he knew he had to continue. It wasn't planned. None of it was. He looked at her, his eyes heavy with guilt. "I felt lost. As if, somehow, I was disconnected from everything around us. From work, from our home, from you, and that justifies what you did?" Lara interrupted, her voice now shaking with the anger that was beginning to overflow. "Does it justify going out with someone else? Cheating on me? No, of course not." He shook his head quickly. "But it was something that happened. And he hesitated, the words stuck in his throat. "That's it?" Lara stared at him, her expression a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Was it something that happened? Because, from my point of view, it seemed well planned, Daniel." Daniel lowered his head, unable to hold her gaze. He knew that anything he said would only increase the hurt, but there was something else, something he hadn't told her yet, something that was trapped inside him and needed to come out, no matter how much it might devastate her. "There's more, isn't there?" Lara asked, crossing her arms. "I can see it on your face. You're still hiding something." He hesitated, looking down at his hands intertwined in his lap. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity, but finally he spoke. "The man you saw me with today," Daniel began, but the sentence soon died away. He took a deep breath, forcing the words out. "It wasn't just an affair. He is manipulating me." Lara frowned, confused. "Manipulating? What do you mean, manipulating?" Daniel looked at her, trying to gather the courage to continue. "He knew things about us, about our lives. Personal information. I walked into something I shouldn't have, Lara." The shock on her face was evident, but he knew he still needed to clarify. "A few months ago, I got involved in a side project outside of work. It seemed too good an opportunity to turn down." He appeared as a kind of investor, offering financial support. But it soon became clear that there were ulterior motives. He started demanding favors. Small ones at first, but growing. "And that involves money? Our money?" Lara asked, her voice now a mixture of anger and incredulity. "Yes, it does." Daniel swallowed. "But not only that. He wanted more. He wanted control. And when he realized that he could use our relationship, I was trapped. I thought I could get around it on my own, without involving you. But now I see that there was no way out. So you've put yourself in a position where he's using you, and our marriage as a bargaining chip?" Lara asked, her anger growing with every word. "I thought I could get out of this before things got worse, but now," Daniel hesitated. "He threatened me, Lara. He said that if I tried to cut the ties, he would destroy not only me, but you too. And he has the tools to do it." Laura was silent for a few seconds, absorbing everything she had just heard. The pieces were finally starting to fit together. Daniel's strange behavior over the last few months, the growing tension between them. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was something bigger, something that put everything they had built at risk. And what did you expect? That I simply wouldn't know? That you would continue to protect me while he destroyed everything we have? Lara's voice was a mixture of hurt and sarcasm. I didn't know how to tell you. Daniel replied, his eyes now watering. I didn't want you to know that I failed. With you, with myself. Lara stood up, unable to remain seated in the face of his confession. She walked to the window, trying to control the emotions that overwhelmed her. There was so much to process, so much that she didn't know how to begin. Finally, she turned to him, tears in her eyes. You didn't just betray me, Daniel. You destroyed the trust we had. And now I don't know what to do with it. He remained silent, unable to respond. He knew that her words were true, that nothing he could say at that moment could change what he had done. All that remained was to wait and see if the love he still felt for her would be enough to rebuild what they had lost. But at that moment, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Silence dominated the house as Daniel and Lara stood on opposite sides of the room. He, defeated, with his eyes fixed on the floor, and she, near the window, looking out as if searching for some way out of the avalanche of emotions that was suffocating her. Daniel's revelation had turned Lara's world into shards, and she now needed to find meaning in everything she had heard, but the weight of what had been destroyed seemed impossible to bear. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice low, almost a whisper. I know that everything I say now will sound empty, but you have to believe me when I say that it wasn't for lack of love for you. I made a mistake. I lost control, and that led us here. Lara glanced at him, her eyes shining with tears that she refused to let fall. Love? She asked, almost laughing, but the sound was bitter. Is that what you call love, Daniel? Betrayal, lies, decisions that put us, in danger. Love should be what protects us, not what destroys us. Daniel stood up slowly, as if his movements carried the full weight of his guilt. He tried to approach, but Lara stepped back, raising her hand like an invisible shield. Don't come near me. Not now. I can't even look at you without feeling like I don't know you anymore. Those words hit him like a blow. It was exactly what he had feared, being unrecognizable in the eyes of the woman he loved most. Even so, he knew he couldn't shirk his responsibility. I understand that you hate me now. I hate what I did too. But, Lara, I need to sort this out. Not just for me, but for you, for us. He seemed to be begging for a chance, but the tone of his voice still carried the hopelessness of someone who knew it might be too late. Lara shook her head, still trying to process the complexity of the situation. It wasn't just the betrayal that consumed her, it was the fact that Daniel had allowed someone else, a stranger, to have so much control over their lives. Solve it? She asked, incredulous. You still think you can just fix it? How? By paying the price he demands? Do you think I want to live knowing that our life, our marriage, is hostage to someone like him? Daniel sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. I can't let him win, Lara. If I allow him to continue manipulating us, he'll destroy everything anyway. I know I've already made mistakes, but I have to try to do the right thing now. Lara crossed her arms, somehow protecting herself from what she was hearing. And what would the right thing be, Daniel? Confront him? Risk even more? How can you think that this is going to end well? Daniel hesitated, but then looked directly at her. I don't know. But to stand by, to accept his conditions, that's the same as giving myself up completely. It's allowing him to control us for the rest of our lives. Maybe it's too late for that. Lara replied, her voice colder. You've already handed over control, Daniel. And in the process, you've lost me too. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time Daniel had no answer. The house felt cramped, suffocating, as if every wall was closing in around them. Lara finally broke the silence again. I need to get out of here. I need air. Space. Something other than this. Daniel didn't try to stop her as she grabbed her coat and walked out the door, leaving him alone in the emptiness that now filled every corner of the house. He knew that Lara needed time, but he also knew that every minute that passed made it harder to repair what had been broken. Lara walked aimlessly through the streets, the tears finally escaping as the cold of the night enveloped her. Daniel's betrayal, the lies, that man's manipulation, everything seemed to blend together in a chaos that she couldn't sort out. She felt lost, as if the life she knew had been snatched from under her feet. In the distance, she saw a small cafe still open and decided to go in, more to escape the cold than to find comfort. She sat down in a corner, ordering a cup of tea that she knew she wouldn't even touch. She needed time to organize her thoughts, but the muffled sound of conversations around her only made her mind spin even faster. Meanwhile, at home, Daniel picked up the phone, hesitating before dialing the number he dreaded. He knew that confrontation was inevitable, but that didn't make the decision any less frightening. The phone rang a few times before being answered. Finally. The voice on the other end was cold and controlled, but carried a tone of superiority that made Daniel cringe. I thought it would take you longer to call. We need to talk. Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was a weakness he couldn't hide. Oh, I knew you'd give in. The man's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried the menace of someone who knew exactly how much power he had. But before we go any further, one thing needs to be clear, you have no choice. Daniel gripped the phone tightly, anger beginning to replace fear. I'm not going to let you destroy my life. He said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The man laughed softly, a sound that made Daniel's blood run cold. Your life, Daniel. You handed it to me on a plate the moment you decided to get involved. The question now is, how much are you willing to sacrifice to try and make it right? Daniel took a deep breath, the weight of the man's words falling on him like an unbearable burden. He knew that the battle had only just begun, and that the decisions he made now would not only shape his future, but Lara's too. And, more than ever, he feared that the price of saving what was left would be too high. Daniel woke up the next morning with a feeling of unease that seemed to have taken over his entire being. The house was silent, and the empty space next to him in bed was a painful reminder that Lara still hadn't returned. He knew he had to act, but the doubt about what the next step would be paralyzed him. The words of the man on the other end of the line the night before still echoed in his mind. He was trapped, and the thought of facing this situation alone terrified him. Meanwhile, Lara was at the home of a longtime friend, someone she knew could listen without judging her. Sitting in the small living room illuminated by the soft light of the early morning, she let off steam, letting the tears finally flow without restraint. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to trust him again after this, said Lara, holding a cup of tea with trembling hands. You don't have to decide now, Lara, replied her friend, her voice calm. But you do need to decide what's best for you. Not what he wants, or what you think you need to do to save something that may already be lost. Her friend's words resonated with Lara like a truth she didn't want to admit. For years, she had put Daniel's well-being, and that of her marriage, before herself. But now, for the first time, she felt she had to choose herself. Daniel, on the other hand, made a decision that he knew was risky, but necessary. He arranged a meeting with the man who controlled the threads of his life, willing to confront him directly. He didn't have a clear plan, but he knew he couldn't continue to be manipulated. When he arrived at the agreed location, a discreet bar in a secluded part of town, Daniel found the man already waiting for him. He was exactly as Daniel remembered, impeccable, with an air of superiority that irritated and intimidated at the same time. So, Daniel, you've finally decided it's time to sort things out," said the man, with a cynical smile. "I'm not here to play your game," replied Daniel, trying to remain calm. "I want to know what you really want and what it's going to take to put an end to it." The man laughed, shaking his head. "Ah, Daniel, you still don't get it, do you? It's not just about what I want. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to protect what's left of your life." Daniel felt his blood boil, but he held back his anger. He knew that losing control would only give the other person more power. "I've already lost enough. You're not taking anything more from me," he said firmly. The man leaned forward, his gaze penetrating. "Are you willing to risk everything, then? Because I could end you. With your career. With your marriage." Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the pressure increase with every second. But at that moment, something inside him changed. He realized that the fear that controlled him was the other man's most powerful weapon. What if he stopped being afraid? "Do whatever you want," Daniel said, surprising even himself. "Expose what you have. Play dirty. I won't live under your control any longer." The man arched an eyebrow, visibly disconcerted by the answer. He hadn't expected Daniel to have the courage to confront him like that. "Interesting," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's see if you can sustain that courage when everything starts to fall apart." Daniel stood up, ignoring the provocation. He knew the battle was far from over, but he had taken the first step towards regaining control of his life. When he returned home, he found Lara waiting for him in the living room. She looked exhausted, but there was a determination in her eyes that Daniel recognized immediately. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Daniel nodded and sat down on the sofa opposite her. The silence between them was heavy, but Lara was the first to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about all this. About us, about what happened, about what still remains." She paused, taking a deep breath. "And I've come to the conclusion that I can't go on like this. I can't stay in a marriage where I feel so betrayed and unprotected." Daniel felt his heart squeeze, but he knew he couldn't argue. He had broken something precious, and it might be impossible to fix. "I understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Lara. I just want you to know that I never meant to hurt you." Lara smiled sadly, tears filling her eyes. "Maybe that makes it even harder, Daniel. Because I know you loved me, but you still chose to betray me." The two of them remained silent, her words hanging in the air like a final sentence. Lara stood up, picking up her things. "I need time. I need to find out who I am without you, without all this," she said, looking at him one last time before leaving. Daniel didn't try to stop her. He knew she was right. And, for the first time, he felt that maybe it was best for both of them. In the months that followed, Daniel struggled to rebuild his life. He faced the consequences of his mistakes, but at the same time began to find the strength to move on. Lara, for her part, rediscovered her independence and learned to prioritize herself. The man who had manipulated Daniel disappeared from their lives, perhaps because he realized that his control was no longer effective. And although the scars remained, both Daniel and Lara found ways to start again, apart but stronger. Now that you've made it this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Comment your opinion and share what you felt as you followed this emotionally charged journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, which show how betrayal destroys lives and relationships. And remember, here, we never support any form of betrayal. See you next time.